For some time, the leading Western nations have acted upon the assumption that democracy is the solution to political conflict, and that the ultimate goal of foreign policy must be to encourage the emergence of democracy in countries which have not yet enjoyed it. And they continue to adhere to this assumption even when considering events in the Middle East today. We can easily sympathise with it, for democracies do not in general go to war with each other, and do not in general experience civil war within their borders. Where the people can choose their government, there is a safety valve that prevents conflicts from overheating. Unpopular governments are rejected without violence. The championship of democracy has therefore become a settled feature of Western foreign policy. In retrospect, the Cold War has been seen as a conflict between democracy and totalitarianism, in which democracy finally triumphed. And with democracy came the liberation of the people of the former communist states. Where there had been tyranny and oppression, there was now freedom and human rights. And if we study the words of Western politicians, we will constantly find that the three ideas, democracy, freedom, and human rights, are spoken of in one breath and assumed in all circumstances to coincide. That, for many of our political leaders, is the lesson to be drawn from the Cold War and the final collapse of the Soviet Empire. In my view, the idea that there is a single one-size-fits-all solution to social and political conflict around the world, and that democracy is the name of it, is based on a disregard of historical and cultural conditions, and a failure to see that democracy is only made possible by other and more deeply hidden institutions. And while we are willing to accept that democracy goes hand in hand with individual freedom and the protection of human rights, we often fail to realize that these three things are three things, not one, and that it is only under certain conditions that they coincide. Democracy was introduced into Russia without any adequate protection for human rights, and many human rights were protected in 19th century Britain long before the emergence of anything that we would call democracy. In the Middle East today, we find parties standing for election, like the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, which regard an electoral victory as the opportunity to crush dissent and impose a way of life that for many citizens is simply unacceptable. In such circumstances, democracy is a threat to human rights and not a way of protecting them. I had the opportunity to study some of these issues during the 1980s, when visiting friends and colleagues who were attempting to plant the seeds of opposition in the communist countries. These were public-spirited citizens who ran the risk of arrest and imprisonment for activities which you and I would regard as entirely innocent. They ran classes for young people who had been deprived of an education on account of their parents' political profile. They established support networks for writers, scholars, musicians and artists who were banned from presenting their work. They smuggled medicines, Bibles, religious symbols and textbooks. And because charities were illegal under communism and religious institutions were controlled by the Communist Party, all this work had to be conducted in secret. The totalitarian system, I learned, endures not simply by getting rid of democratic elections and imposing a one-party state. It endures by abolishing the distinction between civil society and the state, and by allowing nothing significant to occur which is not controlled by the party. By studying the situation in Eastern Europe, I came quickly to see that political freedom depends upon a delicate network of institutions, which my friends were striving to understand, and, if possible, to resuscitate. So what are these institutions? First among them is judicial independence. In every case where the Communist Party had an interest, the judge was under instructions to deliver the verdict that the party required. It didn't matter that there was no law that the victim had breached. If necessary, a law could be invented at the last moment. If the party wanted someone to be in prison, then the judge had to put that person in prison. If he refused, then he would end up in prison himself, if he was lucky. In such circumstances, the rule of law was a complete fiction. Law was simply a mask worn by the party as it dictated its decisions to the people. Then there is the institution of property rights. Normal people in the communist state had virtually nothing to their name, nothing legal, that is. Their house or flat was owned by the state, Their few personal possessions could not be freely traded in the market, and their salary and pension depended on political conformity and could be removed at any time. In these circumstances, the entire economy went underground. No court of law would enforce the contracts that people needed if they were to get on with their lives. You might have a deal with your neighbour to exchange vegetables for maths lessons. But if one of you defected and the other took the dispute to law, the only result would be that you would both go to prison for conducting an illegal business. All transactions, therefore, depended upon personal trust, in a situation in which trust was in shorter and shorter supply. Hence, society was riven by conflicts and suspicions, which neither law nor politics could remedy. And the Communist Party rejoiced in this situation, since it prevented people from combining against it. Then there is freedom of speech and opinion. The freedom to entertain and express opinions, however offensive to others, has been regarded since Locke in the 17th century as the precondition of a political society. This freedom was enshrined in the American Constitution, defended in the face of the Victorian moralists by John Stuart Mill, and upheld in our time by my dissident friends. We take this freedom so much for granted that we regard it as the default position of humanity, the position to which we return if all oppressive powers are removed from us. But my experience of communist Europe convinced me of the opposite. Orthodoxy, conformity, and the hounding of the dissident define the default position of mankind, and there is no reason to think that democracies are any different in this respect from Islamic theocracies or one-party totalitarian states. Of course, the opinions that are suppressed change from one form of society to another, as do the methods of suppression. But we should be clear that to guarantee freedom of opinion goes against the grain of social life, and imposes risks that people may be reluctant to take. You are not just questioning a belief. You are threatening the social order that has been built on it. Also, orthodoxies are the more fiercely protected, the more vulnerable they are. Both those principles are surely obvious from the reaction of Islamists to criticisms directed at their faith. Just as in the wars of religion that ravaged Europe in the 17th century, it is precisely what is absurd that is most protected. And critics are not treated merely as people with an intellectual difficulty. They are a threat, the enemies of society, and, for the believer, the enemies of God. So it was too under communism, in which a system of government had been built on theories that may have looked plausible in the early days of the Industrial Revolution, but which, in the post-war economy of Europe, were palpably ridiculous. For that very reason, it was the greatest heresy to criticize them. Finally, there is legitimate opposition. This was perhaps the greatest casualty of communism as it afflicted Europe. When Lenin imposed the communist system on Russia, it was in the form of a top-down dictatorship in which orders were passed down to the ranks below. It was a kind of military government, and opposition could no more unite against it than soldiers in the ranks can unite against their commanders. In times of emergency, this kind of discipline is perhaps necessary, but it is the opposite of civilized government. It has been assumed in this country from the time of the Anglo-Saxons that political decisions are taken in council, after hearing all sides to the question and taking note of the many interests that must be reconciled. Long before the advent of democracy, our Parliament divided into government and opposition, and except in stressful periods during the 16th and 17th centuries, it was acknowledged that government without opposition is without any corrective when things go wrong. That is what we saw in the Soviet Union and its empire, a system of government without a reverse gear, which continued headlong towards the brick wall of the future. In the underground universities of communist Europe, my friends and colleagues studied those things and prepared themselves for the hoped-for day when the Communist Party, having starved itself of every rational input, would finally give up the ghost. And the lessons that they learned need to be learned again today, as our politicians lead us forth under the banner of democracy, without pausing to examine what democracy actually requires. Last week I examined some of the institutions that form part of democracy as we in the West understand it. But I have yet to consider the fundamental point, which is that in a democracy we consent to be governed by people we dislike. In Egypt today, many people refuse to accept the result of the recent elections. The army has stepped in, ostensibly to maintain order, but in fact to impose the kind of disorder with which armies are equipped to deal, the disorder of the battlefield. Just why this has happened is a topic to which I return next week. But we should not assume that the Egyptian people are any different from the rest of us when it comes to the hard discipline of being governed by people you dislike. I know from my own experience just how hard this discipline can be. My father was a staunch Labour supporter. He believed that Tory politicians were all corrupt representatives of an oppressive ruling class, and that the entire English establishment, the Church of England, the House of Lords, the monarchy, the squirearchy, the old universities, the industrialists and financiers, you name it, was a system of exploitation, erected to benefit the few at the expense of the many. I think that was a common view among Labour supporters in those days, and the Labour Party itself did not take a great deal of trouble to refute it. As a result, my father actually hated the Tory party and all those who sat in Parliament as members of it. We could do nothing to pacify his rage when the Tory party made the mistake of winning an election, or when a Tory government passed some law that seemed to him to damage the interests of the trade unions or the working class. For several days in the wake of such events he would be unapproachable. But he accepted the result, accepted its legitimacy, accepted that he had no recourse other than to campaign for the repeal of the laws that offended him. I experienced a version of my father's habitual rage when the government of Tony Blair decided, in the face of massive opposition from ordinary people living in the countryside, to ban our traditional forms of hunting. This seemed to me to be a new kind of legislation, aimed at a minority and fired by sentiments that ought to have no place in Parliament. It affected me, since hunting is part of my life and the life of my rural neighbours. But I had to swallow my disappointment and to acknowledge that the law is legitimate. I can campaign for a repeal, but I am duty-bound as a citizen to obey it. Accepting it is one part of the burden that I and other Tories have suffered under 13 years of Labour government, the burden of being ruled by people we disagree with, and some of whom we actively dislike. I think people are not as aware as they should be of how contrary to human nature it is to accept orders from those with whom you do not agree. Many have seen the events of the Arab Spring as involving a popular movement for democracy against autocratic government, and to some extent this is true. But one thing that has been very noticeable, especially in Tunisia, Libya and Egypt, has been the emergence of democratically elected governments that have no time for opinions other than their own. In Western democracies, our governments are aware that many people, perhaps even a majority, did not vote for them, and that they must therefore make themselves acceptable to their opponents. Look at the pronouncements of the recently elected and recently deposed President Morsi of Egypt, however, and you will find little or nothing to suggest that he is aware that there are Egyptians who disagree with him, and whose consent must be constantly solicited. It is impossible to discern from his speeches that there is a substantial minority of Egyptian citizens who are Christians, others who are atheists, others who, while following the Muslim way of life, would rather it did not make a show of itself as the state religion. His view of elections is that they grant an absolute right to impose the ruling party's agenda, and that opponents have lost all right to an agenda of their own. And the response of the army is to say, not so. The only ones with a right to impose their agenda are we, who represent the interests of all Egyptians, and not just those of the Muslim Brotherhood. The fact that we have to kill quite a few Egyptians to prove that we represent them is just one of those things. In our own system, the opposition is a legitimate part of the legislative process. Laws are seldom steamrollered through Parliament without regard for disagreement, and the general assumption is that the final result will be a compromise, an attempt to reconcile the many conflicting interests. This idea of legislation as a compromise is an unusual one. The natural order is that described in the Old Testament, in which kings rule by decree, taking advice perhaps, but not allowing a voice to interests other than their own. There are aspects of human life in which compromise is either suspect or forbidden. In battle, you don't compromise with the enemy. In religion, you don't compromise with the devil. And it is when religion intrudes into politics that the political process is most at risk. This is the reason why, in the history of modern Egypt, successive presidents have tried to keep the Muslim Brotherhood out of power. The Brotherhood believes that law and politics are not about compromise, but about obedience to the will of God. In the 17th century, our country was torn apart by civil war, and at the heart of that civil war was religion. The Puritan desire to impose godly rule on the people of Great Britain, regardless of whether they wanted it, and the leaning of the Stuart kings towards a Roman Catholic faith that had become deeply antipathetic to the majority, and a vehicle for unwanted foreign interference. In a civil war, both sides behave badly, precisely because the spirit of compromise has fled from the scene. The solution is not to impose a new set of decrees from on high, but to make room for opposition and the politics of compromise. This was recognized at the Glorious Revolution of 1688, when Parliament was re-established as the supreme legislative institution, and the rights of the people against the sovereign power were reaffirmed the following year in a Bill of Rights. This raises what for me is the most important question concerning the Middle East today, which is that of reconciling religious obedience and the secular rule of law. That question was debated by the early Church, and indeed raised by Jesus himself in the parable of the tribute money. In that parable, Jesus invites us to render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, and to God what is God's. In other words, to obey Caesar when dealing with the ordinary affairs of government, while remaining obedient in our personal life to the commands of religion. His assumption was that we could reconcile the one obedience with the other, since the commandments of religion are simple and obvious. Indeed, there are only two of them, namely, to love God entirely and your neighbour as yourself. Jesus assumed that those two commandments would never jeopardize the legitimate demands of government, and this assumption was built into its pronouncements by the early Church. Of course, there is a long history of conflict in Europe between Pope and Emperor, and between religious enthusiasm and the secular law. But it is fair to say that by the end of the 17th century, as the Enlightenment spread its influence far and wide across our civilization, it was beginning to be accepted that we manage our affairs in this world by passing our own laws, that these laws are man-made, secular, and if possible neutral when it comes to the various religions that compete within the state. In any apparent clash between secular law and religious obedience, it has become accepted in our society that secular law must prevail. The hope has been that the two spheres of duty, the sacred and the secular, are sufficiently separate, so that there would in any case be little or no overlap between them. To put it bluntly, religion in our society has become a private affair, which makes no demands of the public as a whole. The privatization of religion has not occurred everywhere in the modern world, and certainly not in the Muslim parts of it. Today we see a Turkey led to the brink of civil unrest by an Islamic prime minister in rebellion against the secular state. We see an Egypt in which the army has stepped in to depose a president who wishes to govern Egypt by Islamic law. We see a region-wide conflict between the Sunni and Shia versions of the faith, which is now tearing Syria apart. And all across the Middle East, freedom of speech, association, and religion are under attack. Why is this, and what should we do about it? I shall address those questions next week. To understand what is happening in the Middle East today, we must look back to the end of the First World War. The Austro-Hungarian Empire had been destroyed, and from the ruins emerged a collection of nation-states. These nation-states, including Austria, Hungary, Romania and Czechoslovakia, were not arbitrary creations. Their boundaries reflected long-standing divisions of language, religion, culture, and ethnicity. And although the whole arrangement collapsed within 2 decades, this was in part because of the rise of Nazism and communism, both ideologies of conquest. Today we take the nation-states of Central Europe for granted. They are settled political entities, each with a government elected by the citizens who live on its soil. When the Austro-Hungarian Empire collapsed, so too did the Ottoman Empire, whose territories embraced the whole of the Middle East and North Africa. The victorious Allies divided up the Ottoman Empire into small territorial states, but very few of these have enjoyed more than a temporary spasm of democracy. Many of them have been governed by clans, sects, families, or the military, usually assisted, as in Syria, by the violent suppression of every group that challenges the ruling power. People often explain the relative absence of democracy in the Middle East by arguing that the carving up of the region into territories bears no relation to the pre-existing loyalties of the people. In a few cases it worked. Ataturk, general of the Turkish army, was able to defend the Turkish-speaking heart of the empire and turn it into a modern state on the European model. Elsewhere, many people identified themselves primarily in religious rather than national terms. Hassan al-Banna, who founded the Muslim Brotherhood in 1928, told his followers that bringing together the world's Muslims in a supranational Islamic state, a caliphate, should be a top priority. The result of imposing national boundaries on people who define themselves in religious terms is the kind of chaos we have witnessed in Iraq, where Sunni and Shia fight for dominance, or the even greater chaos that we now witness in Syria, where a minority Islamic sect, the Alawites, has maintained a monopoly of social power since the rise of the al-Assad family. By contrast, we in Europe are more inclined to define ourselves in national terms. In any conflict, it is the nation that must be defended. And if God once ordered otherwise, then it is time he changed his mind. Such an idea is anathema to Islam, which is based on the belief that God has laid down an eternal law, and it is up to us to submit to it. That is what the word Islam means, submission. Sunni Islam was the official faith of the Ottomans, and no other form of Islam was formally recognized. Toleration was extended to the various Christian sects, to Zoroastrians and to Jews, but the official story over several centuries was that the empire was ruled by the Sharia, the holy law of Islam, augmented by a civil code and by the domestic law of the various permitted sects. Ataturk abolished the Sultanate and established a new civil code based on European precedents, and he drew up a constitution that expressly severed all connection with Islamic law, forbade Islamic forms of dress, outlawed polygamy, imposed a secular system of education, and enjoined allegiance to the Turkish homeland as the primary duty of every Turk. In any crisis, when loyalty is at stake, you are to identify yourself first of all as a Turk, and only then as a Muslim. And he allowed the sale of alcohol, so that the Turkish people could drink to their new condition in the way that he preferred. Ataturk remade Turkey as a comparatively open and prosperous country that could turn a proud face to the modern world, for he made it into a nation, defined by language and territory rather than by party or faith. Universal adult suffrage for both sexes was introduced into Turkey in 1933, and the country continues to be governed by a legal system that derives its authority from human legislators rather than divine revelation. At the same time, its population is almost entirely Muslim and experiences the inevitable nostalgia for the pure and beautiful way of life invoked in the Quran. There is therefore tension between the secular state and the religious feelings of the people. Ataturk was aware of this tension and appointed the army as the guardian of the secular constitution. He imposed a system of education for army officers that would make them instinctive opponents of the obscurantism of the clerics. The army was to be the advocate of progress and modernity, which would place patriotism above piety in the hearts of the people. In obedience to its appointed role, the Turkish army has several times stepped in to uphold Ataturk's vision. It took over in 1980, when the Soviet Union was actively trying to subvert Turkish democracy, and nationalists and leftists were fighting it out in the streets. The army has also made its presence felt in recent years, when the government of Prime Minister Recep Erdogan has taken a step back towards the old Islamic values. Erdogan's Justice and Development Party is nominally secular, but he is a man of the people and a sincere Muslim, who believes that the Quran contains the divinely inspired and uniquely valid guide to human life. He is not happy with a constitution that puts patriotism above piety, and which makes the army, rather than the mosque, into the guardian of social order. He has put a large number of leading army officers on trial on charges of subversion, some of them now jailed for life. The trials have been denounced as a travesty of justice, but those who say this are likely to be accused of subversion themselves. Journalists opposed to Erdogan's policies have a remarkable tendency to end up in jail. Newspapers that criticise the Prime Minister find themselves confronted with crippling tax demands or massive fines, and popular protests are put down with whatever force may be required. In Turkey, opposition is now becoming dangerous. The Turkish case vividly illustrates the point that democracy, freedom and human rights are not one thing but three. Erdogan has a large following. He has 3 times won an election with a substantial majority, but the elementary freedoms that we take for granted have been rather jeopardized than enhanced by this. The Egyptian example is even more pertinent. The Muslim Brotherhood has always sought to be a mass movement, seeking to establish itself by popular support, but its most influential leader, Sayyid Qutb, denounced the whole idea of the secular state as a kind of blasphemy, an attempt to usurp the will of God by passing laws that have a merely human authority. Qutb was executed by President Nasser, who came to power in a military coup, and ever since then the Muslim Brotherhood and the army have played against each other. The Brotherhood aims for a populist government, and recently won an election that it took to authorize the remaking of Egypt as an Islamic republic. The posters waved by Morsi's supporters did not advocate democracy or human rights. They said, "All of us are with the Sharia." The army has replied by saying, "No, only some of us are." So why cannot a modern state govern itself by Islamic law? This is a controversial issue about which there are many learned views. Here, for what it is worth, is mine. The original schools of Islamic jurisprudence, which arose in the wake of the Prophet's reign in Medina, permitted jurists to adapt the law to the changing needs of society by a process of reflection known as ijtihad, or effort. But this seems to have been brought to an end during the 8th century of our era, when it was maintained by the then dominant theological school that all important matters had been settled, and that the gate of ijtihad is closed. Trying to introduce the Sharia today therefore runs the risk of imposing on people a system of law designed for the government of a long-since vanished community, and unable to adapt to the changing circumstances of human life. To put the point in a nutshell, secular law adapts, religious law merely endures. Moreover, precisely because the Sharia has not adapted, nobody really knows what it says. Does it tell us to stone adulterers to death? Some say yes, some say no. Does it tell us that investing money at interest is in every case forbidden? Some say yes, some say no. When God makes the laws become as mysterious as God is. When we make the laws, and make them for our purposes, we can be certain what they mean. The only question then is, who are we? What way of defining ourselves reconciles democratic elections with real opposition and individual rights? That, to my mind, is the most important question facing the West today. It is important because, as I shall argue next week, we too are giving the wrong answer. Many writers have warned against the tyranny of the majority. Majority opinion may be wrong. Majority desires may be wicked. Majority strength may be dangerous. There is someone more important than the crowd, which is the person who disagrees with it. We must protect that person, for he's the one who can raise the question that no crowd wants to listen to, which is the question whether it is in the right. Until opposition is protected, therefore, there is no door through which reason can enter the affairs of government. But how is opposition protected? What makes it possible for people to agree to disagree? In families, people often get together to discuss matters of shared concern. There will be many opinions, conflicting counsels, and even factions. But in a happy family, everyone will accept to be bound by the final decision, even if they disagree with it. They have a shared investment in staying together. Something is more important to all of them than their own opinion, and that is the family, the thing whose welfare and future they have come together to discuss. To put it in another way, the family is part of their identity. It is the thing that does not change as their several opinions alter and conflict. A shared identity takes the sting from disagreement. It is what makes opposition and therefore rational discussion possible, and it is the foundation of any way of life in which compromise rather than dictatorship is the norm. The same is true in politics. Opposition, the free expression of dissent, and the rule of compromise all presuppose a shared identity. There has to be a first-person plural, a we, if the many individuals are to stay together, accepting each other's opinions and desires regardless of disagreements. Religion provides such a first-person plural. I might define myself as a Christian or a Muslim, and that might be sufficient to bind me to my fellow believers, even when we disagree on matters of day-to-day government. But, as I argued last week, that kind of first-person plural does not sit easily with democratic politics. In particular, it does not accept the most fundamental disagreement within the state, between the faithful who accept the ruling doctrine and the heretics who don't. Besides, modern systems of law are defined by territory and not by doctrine. In Egypt, it is the law of Egypt that you are bound to obey, not the law of Turkey or Greece. Hence the need for a national rather than a religious we. A nation-state is the byproduct of human neighbourliness, shaped by an invisible hand from the countless agreements between people who speak the same language and live side by side. It results from compromises established after many conflicts, and expresses the slowly forming agreement among neighbours, both to grant each other space and to protect that space as common territory. It depends on localized customs and a shared routine of tolerance. Its law is territorial rather than religious, and invokes no source of authority higher than the intangible assets that its people share. All those features are strengths, since they feed into an adaptable form of pre-political commitment. Unless and until people identify themselves with the country, its territory and its cultural inheritance, in something like the way people identify themselves with a family, the politics of compromise will not emerge. People have to take their neighbours seriously, as fellow citizens with an equal claim to protection, for whom they might be required, in moments of crisis, to lay down their lives. They do this because they believe themselves to belong together in a shared home. The history of the world is proof of this. Wherever people identify themselves in terms that are not shared by their neighbours, then the state falls apart at the first serious blow, as has happened in the former Yugoslavia, in Syria and Lebanon, and in Nigeria today. In the wake of the Second World War, the political elite in the defeated nations became sceptical towards the nation-state. The European Union arose from the belief that the European wars had been caused by national sentiment, and that what is needed is a new transnational form of government, which will unite people around their shared interest in peaceful coexistence. Unfortunately, people don't identify themselves in that way. There is no first-person plural of which the European institutions are the political expression. The Union is founded in a treaty, and treaties derive their authority from the entities that sign them. Those entities are the nation-states of Europe, from which the loyalties of the European people derive. The Union, which has set out to transcend those loyalties, therefore suffers from a permanent crisis of legitimacy. Last week I suggested that the desire of the Muslim Brotherhood to govern Egypt by Islamic law poses a danger to the secular state. A politics of compromise is possible only if law can change to reflect the changing needs of society. And laws laid down by God have the eternal and changeless character of their author. But the same defect attends laws laid down by a treaty. Treaties are dead hands, which should be laid upon a country only for specific and essential purposes, and never as a way of governing it. Here is an example of what I mean. When the Treaty of Rome was signed in 1957, it included a clause permitting the free movement of capital and labour between the signatories. At the time, incomes and opportunities were roughly similar across the small number of states who signed. Now things are very different. The European Union has expanded to include most of the former communist states of Eastern Europe, whose citizens now have the legal right to take up residence within our national borders, competing for jobs at a time when we have over 2 million unemployed. A great many British citizens are unhappy with this, but because the law permitting it is inscribed within the treaty, and because the treaty takes precedence over parliamentary legislation, there is nothing that can be done about it. It is just as though we too were governed by a kind of religious law, in which the will of God sounds through every edict, preventing even the most necessary change. Why did the experiment in federal government, which has led to an unaccountable empire in Europe, lead to a viable democracy in America? The answer is simple. Because American federalism created not an empire, but a nation-state. This happened despite the dispute over states' rights and the Civil War. It happened because the American settlement established a secular rule of law, a territorial jurisdiction, and a common language in a place that the people were claiming as their home. Under the American settlement, people were to treat each other as neighbours, not as fellow members of a race, a religion, or a class, but as fellow settlers in the land that they shared. Their commitment to the political order grew from the obligations of neighbourliness, and disputes between them were to be settled by the law of the land. The law was to operate within territorial boundaries defined by the prior affections of the people, and not by some transnational bureaucracy. In short, democracy needs boundaries, and boundaries need the nation-state. All the ways in which people come to define their identity in terms of the place where they belong have a part to play in cementing the sense of nationhood. For example, the common law of the Anglo-Saxons, in which laws emerge from the resolution of local conflicts rather than being imposed by the sovereign, has had a large part to play in fostering the English and American sense that the law is the common property of all who reside within its jurisdiction, rather than the creation of priests, bureaucrats, or kings. A shared language and shared curriculum have a similar effect in making familiarity, proximity, and day-to-day custom into sources of common loyalty. The essential thing about nations is that they grow from below, through habits of free association among neighbours, and result in loyalties that are firmly attached to a place and its history, rather than to a religion, a dynasty, or, as in Europe, to a self-perpetuating political class. What matters to us in our democracy is not that majority opinion should prevail, but that we should be equal participants in the political process and equally protected by it. In a nation-state, the law is the common property of every citizen. It stands above every person and every faction. It protects the dissenter from the orthodox, the minority from the majority, and the nation as a whole from those who seek to confiscate its assets. It does this by bringing us all together in a shared first-person plural. We in Europe are moving not towards democracy, but away from it, as we lose the right to define ourselves in that way. Democracy ends when we find ourselves governed not by us, but by them.